log on and would like to watch back. So thank you ever so much. Secondly, I'd just like to thank Fram Farmers for kindly sponsoring this event and our other technical forums. So before we get going, I will be hoping to ask everyone at the end for any future topics. So obviously we're hoping that this is going to be quite a good interactive conversation. We're hoping that people will be looking to get involved. And the subject matter of these technical forums is very much driven by what you, me, us as farmers are looking to discuss. So please just put your thinking caps on, and at the end, if you have any preferences on topics, then feel free to put them in the search bar. Any feedback is greatly appreciated. So this evening we're going to be talking to Phil Jarvis. So welcome, Phil. Thanks very much for joining us. And the title is The Power of the Environment to Power the Bottom Line. So I'm sure we can all agree that it's a subject that's becoming ever more prominent, within the media, and certainly something that we're all sitting up and taking a bit more care of. With regards to questions, if everybody could put their questions in the Q&A section or raise your hand. We're quite happy to take questions all the way through the presentation. So if you have a burning question, stick it in and we'll do our best to answer it on the way through. I think that just about covers all our admin. So I think over to you, Phil. I gather you're farming up in Leicestershire. So if you'd like to tell us a little bit more about that, we'll get going. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you very much indeed, Chris, and thanks for those people that have joined on this webinar. First and foremost, my role really is as a farmer for nearly 30 years at the Allerton Project, which is based in Leicestershire on heavy soils. And my role has evolved into the head of farming, training and partnerships. So a research and demonstration farm for the Game and Wildlife Conservation Trust, looking at all landscape management from food production through to wildlife habitat and enhancement. But I'm also in a past chair of the National Farmers Union Environment Forum, and so have been have quite a lot of exposure to some of those issues that are beginning to or have affected farming and landscape use for a long time. So what I'm going to try and do is now I'm going to try and share my screen with you, and hope you can see this when it comes along. I'm hoping now that you can see that. Chris, can you just let me know whether you can see that?
Yeah, I've got that, Phil.
So the power of the environment to the bottom line. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to try and take you through a little bit of a journey about where we are at Loddington, what the farm does here. The big picture is some of the challenges that are facing us. And then I'm really going to concentrate on 10 areas where the environment might help us and try and identify the challenges and the opportunities. Now, this isn't all plain sailing as well. There's a lot of aspiration coming from certain quarters about how we'll solve a number of problems. But hopefully, when we've gone through those 10 areas, as I go through, please do ask questions and we'll see how we get on. So first of all, this crest here is when I arrived at Loddington in 1992. This was the emblem of the Allerton Project. And the project has really been involved in things like beetle banks and agri-environment habitats. And it's looked at a lot of water and soil experimentation, and soil is really key to what we're going to be doing in the future. And there are some real big challenges around soil and how you keep structure, how you keep it friable, how you keep it resilient for both hot, cold, wet and dry conditions. And we've seen all of those in the last 12 to 18 months. And it seems to be, weather and climate seems to be changing. So soil and water are really key at the Allerton Project. And then we might just touch on the subject of regenerative farming. What does it mean? So this is through reduced cultivations, cover cropping, the use of cover crops, and the use of perhaps habitats to help us with some of our farming operations. And then we'll just touch on greenhouse gases and possibly carbon as a new product on the marketplace that might give us some form of helping address some of those climate change issues, but also look at how we might, from provide some income for businesses as well, and how that might help us. And of course, we'll talk about songbirds. There's a small shoot at the Allerton Project, and a lot of the information that we deliver with our research work as well gets out with our visitors centre. And so the old Allerton Research and Education Trust became the GWCT Allerton Project, and that's where we stand at the moment. So first and foremost, the Allerton Project is a farm. We've recently, we were about 800 hectares with a joint venture with our neighbour. We have split our ways a little bit since we've had more research projects to do, which have made economies of scale much more difficult. But growing cereals, going 6 or 7 crops in a rotation, very much a lot of our research is based on a farming system on heavy clay soils. Not much light land on ours, so the wetter it is, the more challenging it gets for us. But the drier it is, then often yields are better with clay being able to store much more water. And we might think about the future, how we make sure that we can store more water in our soils rather than letting it run off, and keeping it in there for periods of dry weather, which, like we've just experienced over the last 4 or 5 weeks, and how we might experience more of that in the future. So a lot of working with a number of partners, from across the industry, from distributors to plant protection product manufacturers, looking at trials around cultivations, so from plough-based systems to min-till systems to direct drill systems, looking at how all that information can put forward to a system that might be able to work for us going forward, and how we might be able to link it in with some of the other government policies that are coming forward. So, technology is going to be one of those solutions as well, I think, getting more efficient, more use of data. So a lot of not only are we trying to get much more efficient with our farming operations, but when we're doing our research and when we're gathering our research, we're trying to use much more digital technology, drone technology, satellite technology, and to make sure that we collect our data in a more efficient way than perhaps some of the methods that we've been used to over the last 20 or 30 years. And giving ourselves maps which then can turn into variable rate maps that can actually not only recognize weeds, but bare soil, can recognize perhaps disease, can recognize what is straw and possibly what's a healthy crop, and then informing us in real time as well, rather than waiting till the end of the season, so we can make decisions based on real-time information. And that's very much where we're developing our next strand of work. Now, when I was putting this together, I thought, well, a technical forum, surely it just means that I'll produce lots of graphs like this and I can talk through 20 odd slides with tables and charts. But I thought best to talk around the subject, but just to give you a flavor of the sort of work we've been doing in the Syngenta project is 5 fields in a rotation, oilseed rape with challenges, winter wheat with challenges, obviously the weather, but some spring cropping, spring beans, winter barley. Would be in those crops, but lots of data created. Actually, a farm down there with Andy Barr as well is one of the other sites that we've got, and another 2 sites, one in Spain and another one in France, have been looking at this combination of min-till, conventional ploughing, and perhaps direct drilling, but bringing up lots and lots of information and some key headlines there about reducing greenhouse gas emissions, increasing earthworms. Less fuel, more farm and birds, and less cultivation costs, and less time would be some of the highlights that would have come out of that work. And of course, any of you that, most of it written up in the Syngenta Spring Guide, and trying to, actually the work that Syngenta is looking at saying, with crop inputs, how do we frame this with environmental habitat as well? So I'd like to see the sustainable farming at the front of Syngenta Spring Guide next year, but the fact that we're doing this work and working with and looking at things like operator pollinator, green headlands, plant breeding as regards ways we might look to try and reduce our impact in the future is all part of the work that we do at the Allerton Project. And of course, not only what we're showing out on the farm, but delivering this through our Eco Visitor Centre. So, straw-lined walls, solar panels, rainwater harvesting, recycled plastic fencing, wood chip for heating, and a new office building made entirely of wood, and that's to try and think about buildings for the future and how we might lock up carbon dioxide in the form of carbon, and how we might then reduce our steel, concrete, and obviously not suitable in all situations, but buildings for the future which can be regrown in our woods and trees that we plant perhaps in the future. So that's a little bit about the Allerton project. What I'd like to move on to now is to talk about some of the big picture challenges that are facing us, and really not just from UK annual temperature, but global annual temperatures as well. And this rather illustrates how gradually temperatures have become warmer. Now, to put it into some context as well, there are periods when it does dip. We've been through a period of cooler weather in April. But I think when we're on our farms, and certainly on our farms, we tend to think of our local weather conditions, and really looking at our temperatures. The big picture is as we get warmer, there are some big challenges around weather patterns and the crops we can grow. So we're starting to see more challenges around crop establishment, more challenges about have we got enough water. And I think those are the things that we're going to have to address in the future that become big problems about how we grow things that we traditionally thought in our maritime climate would just appear and just go through a season, and that would be it. We're getting loads of seasons out of things. But as some things disappear maybe from our cropping calendars, other things might join us, or other crops might be able to. So maybe more grapes, maybe more sunflowers, more crops that are with usually a more continental climate. So whilst we might think that's years in the distance, gradually those warmer temperatures may well result in that happening. And I think so if we look at from whether it be the Climate Change Committee in the UK or IPCC or our 25-year environment plan or documents like the NFU's Achieving Net Zero, this balance between sustainable food production, biodiversity net gain, carbon net zero, and landscape recovery or local recovery, these are the challenges and these are the directions that are being given to us by the government and by the authors of 25-year environment plan and advisors such as Dieter Helm, who will be involved in things like this document. And then as the farmers, what does that mean for our farming? What does it mean for our landscape? And what are going to be the challenges for us? And this aspiration to make sure that we enhance the environment linked with sustainable food production, how do we balance that out? And I picked, this is a picture from 4 or 5 years ago at Loddington, one of the only hay meadows left in Leicestershire. There are very few of them left now, unless they're on a floodplain. And I suppose really, how do we get a balance between habitat like this, which might not be very productive farming wise, but is pretty productive from the environment's point of view, and how do we value that? And those of you that might have seen Henry Dimbleby's latest TED talk, he very much concentrated on the subject of how do we value the environment and how do we value nature itself. So of course, let's talk a little bit more detail now and a little bit more, and I promise you there's not too many slides with these sort of documents on them, but this pathway to agricultural transition. So we know that there's a reduction in direct payments, we know that there's a productivity grants, we know there's exit and entrance strategies, and there's 3 levels of support. And the one that's been mostly talked about at the moment under this environmental land management, or ELMS, is a sustainable farming incentive. Then there's another scheme which will talk a bit more about habitat and collaboration, and then big picture stuff around forests, coastal reorganization, which is the landscape recovery. So much fewer number of those projects, and that really goes to make up ELMS. And that's what the government is as we embark away from a common agricultural policy, we end up in this environment. Now, of course, promises in health and harmony papers about streamlined. It's quite difficult when we all have been asked to consult and co-design. When you ask that to the industry, you usually have a lot of things to co-design and talk about. So, of course, with different levels of standards for soil and habitat and grassland, it's not quite as easy as we might think. And in some of the February 2021, the first policy discussion document had over 1,600 responses, 135 pages of it. And And the first one is the one I really want to pick up. Was really, there are two schools of thought, and you could say, well, no surprises there. The one is farmers who were thinking about food production, sustainable, financial, viable, economic model for their business against perhaps some of the environmental and conservation aspirations of other organizations. And how do we frame this so either end of that spectrum don't actually say, well, this is a bit of a, we've got a mess here, how do we find a win-win? And I think that will be the challenge. So some of the other things which I'll bring up very quickly about, there was widespread support for the principles with some caveats. Some people thought there was a lack of ambition and lack of detail. So there's very much a lack of detail in some of this documentation. Obviously, any of you that might be involved in some of the pilots now, you'll only be finding out about that after you've signed up. Payment rates. And payment rates is an interesting one. I think we've got to a situation where if you're on a very productive farm, are the payment rates attractive enough to make you perhaps forsake an 800 to 900 pound gross margin to take gross margin to take a payment of 500 to 600 pounds. Now, if you're productivity or you have some lower yielding land, then that might be attractive. But I think that's one of the conundrums that we're facing at the moment. And of course, there was some agreement in some of the areas that we might look at. There was also, a lot of the respondents saying they'd had poor previous experience with agri-environment schemes, and so making it streamlined and making it right for the practitioner on the ground is really careful. Is really a point that needs to be taken on board by DEFRA as they evolve their pilot schemes and as we transition into this new scheme. There's a role for advice because you usually get better outcomes when you take advice, but who pays for it? Where will we get it from? How will we self-assess our schemes? What will the bureaucracy be like around, some of the verification and certification of these schemes is always slightly worrying to those of us who are farming by day and then haven't got a huge amount of resource to take on paperwork and plans, and a lot of that might be coming with the new iterations of sustainable farm incentive. Pilots will be valuable, and there will be regional variation. So that was the crux of where we've gone there. So I'm going to just a couple of slides before I talk about some of the more practical issues here. Is it's all very well having a direction of travel that takes us on this journey towards environmental enhancement, but what are our trading arrangements? We can, if you like, in the 25-year environment plan, it states about being a global leader, not just about being a leader in environment in the United Kingdom and in environmental enhancement, which we should support, and really for the future of our countryside, we should really embrace, but not at the cost of running farmers out of business in this country and actually saying, well, we'll just go and buy it from another part of the world. And really the World Trade Organization, and I've already seen this trust making comments around a shake-up of the World Trade Organization. World Trade Organization, trade and transport of goods across the world is one of the areas which is causing us problems with greenhouse gas emissions and with how we look after or treat other parts of the planet in order to satisfy demand for food. And so I might add in suggestions for animal health and perhaps environmental considerations and perhaps worker standards as well across there into the World Trade Organization, so it gives it a much more rounded and balanced approach, and therefore the areas that the United Kingdom is already well along the lines of are taken into consideration. And briefly, my Brexit slide is, how we've reached a position, hopefully in the short term, where our trading arrangements with our closest partners, which were seen to be reasonable in the past, seem to have taken a bit of a road bump, and how we address those so that we can keep good trade routes open, local trade routes open, and hopefully that is going to sort itself out, because that puts a tremendous strain on our ability to either export, or is it an opportunity for us to fulfill the marketplace in our own shores? And of course that links back, and I'll mention this at the end, about carbon footprints and how procurement of our own food will reduce the UK's carbon footprint. So let's look at a few debates here and open up So let's talk about the livestock and plant versus plant debate, and what, about having less dairy products or less meat products. I think really we really do need to have a balanced conversation and balanced point of views. The maritime climate, we talk about good grass growth, being able to convert cellulose into protein that's part of a balanced diet, which gives us lots of nutrition, is a fair, and that lower carbon footprint from within our shores is a fair discussion point against potentially what we might be looking at is maybe almonds, and this is the top picture is almond groves, and the bottom one is soya in Argentina, where we perhaps pursue a different sort of diet at the expense or grown in areas of the world where water might not be so plentiful. So I think there has to be a balance there. And I might want to add into that conversation that any of you that follow the discussion around whether animals are causing the problem, I might suggest that when we had 2 billion people on the planet, there wasn't such a problem, and we had lots of animals on the planet. I think the problem we might have to look in the mirror a little bit about where the problem arises from. And I think animals, and if you listen to Alan Savory, he'll talk to you about how regenerating soil and regenerating things, livestock, are very much a part of that cycling process of carbon and nitrogen. So just some food for thought there about making sure it's a balanced debate, balanced diet. So let's talk a little bit, and one of the things I've admitted at the beginning was that I'm chair of the voluntary initiative, which is basically looking at championing IPM and best practice, protecting water and making better informed decisions. So where are we with chemistry, and how we're going to use IPM in the future to look at how we might produce food? So I would say that the new integrated pest management plan that's coming out would hope people would do that, because it gives you a score of where you are on your IPM journey. And I think government is also looking at where farmers and the industry generally are on our IPM journey, and how we balance better targeted use of crop inputs, better filling areas, better transfer systems, better nozzle techniques, more technology, and better protection of water courses, so that we get the best out of crop production systems, and how we might merge them with some of the more organic principles, so we end up with this organic fusion. But it has to be an economic model that businesses can pursue as well. So it's just a point worth mentioning. And I just mentioned something about, what will portfolios look like in the future? Will biopesticides and biostimulants, there's more of them in the UK market now. UK is, in the middle ground as regards that second graph about where the number of biopesticides are registered in the UK at the moment. So a growing market, but once again, has to be backed by science and evidence. Does it work? And at what cost does it come to the producer to make that work? And also we'll be looking at environmental sustainability as well. So here's some work from Loddington, where we've got 3 systems: a plough-based system, which is the blue one, sustainable min-till, and then a light-till system. And the bottom graphs are just showing that actually in some of our sustainable and light-till systems, earthworms thrive quite nicely in 2 of those systems. In the conventional one, there's less of them. And from one year to the next, so the right-hand side of that first graph, you've got the similar trend, but the difference there is soil moisture. The second year, really dry year. The first year, plentiful soil moisture. So climate and dry soils can perhaps make much more difference than perhaps. And all of those systems, for example, would have had glyphosate. So weather probably and cultivation can have an impact, as well as the use of plant protection products. And then we've been looking at our greenhouse gas emissions over those systems. And even though nitrous oxide is a really important gas, and so is methane, still we were finding that our conventional system across the board left more greenhouse gases than perhaps some of our min-till systems. Although we have seen in very wet weather more nitrous oxide coming out of some of our plots, and that's ongoing work. Chris, I'm conscious I've talked quite a bit there. Have we got any questions coming yet?
I actually do have a question, just skipping back slightly, if that's all right. You mentioned, or obviously beginning livestock and the balance between livestock and cropping, and how do you balance the sort of perceived ethical challenges surrounding livestock production with the benefits to the carbon sequestration and sort of environmental balance that you talked about, and also how do we get that message across to the general public? Sorry if I'm skipping ahead slightly.
No. Well, I mean, no, that's a good question. It's one of the reasons I included it in the presentation. The fact that I'm careful about the words I use, but just because you shout very loudly about things doesn't necessarily mean that science and evidence would support your view. So I think from a point of view about a balance, people's eating habits are completely up to them, but I would say about local, healthy, using the best use of the resource that you've got. So for example, a large part of the United Kingdom has only the potential to grow grass. Yes, we can grow trees. Yes, we can store water. And yes, we can perhaps change the landscape management. But it's actually, that carbon footprint of livestock and the health benefits, and protein and fat actually in a balanced diet are very much good for sustaining our fueling our system, should I say. And lots of carbohydrate isn't necessarily all a great thing. So everything's about a balance. And I think the question is about I think the one thing you've got to be is just very proactive about the produce you produce rather than detrimental about what other people produce in other parts of the world. So recognize there are 2 points of view, but I mean, I'm going to talk about it at the end about how you might market and tell your story to your local audience. But I also think there are other things we can do by getting parts of academia to help us, to get doctors to help us about balanced diet. So there's a different voice and a different narrative being told from those that work in science and academia. Does that answer your question, Chris?
Yes, thank you. We do have another question here from Jan. They're saying there's a big concern about the export of our carbon footprints, and how do we as livestock producers get this over to almond milk drinkers?
Yeah, and along a similar vein, I think history will show that a lot of our industrial processes, around coal and steel and cars, or certainly steel, we may well have reduced our carbon footprint here, but we've possibly increased it around other parts of the world as we've imported more. And I think once again, the same dilemma will be facing the government, but it might get wrapped up in other trade agreements, in the fact that agriculture might suffer at the expense of a good trade deal on other parts. So putting forward about importing carbon footprints is something that should always be made in every conversation. And I'd probably like to return to that right at the end about how we might engage with local authorities to try and make that point, that actually valuing nature and valuing what's on your doorstep from your producers can help local authorities meet some of their climate targets without just buying food from wherever they can source it the most cheapest, because it doesn't come with a carbon footprint from that, or certainly it isn't highlighted enough. And I think that's where we can benefit. So I'm not going to not answer it, but I'll shelve it towards the end if I may.
Yeah, absolutely. And we do have one more question here as well.
Yeah.
If you're happy to take that now.
Yeah.
So this is from Tom Gribble, and he is saying, do you fear that British agriculture will fall down in the middle between production and the environment and struggle to find its place? He has also made a comment saying that surely regional marketing along with supermarket support could help us along our way.
Yeah, no, that's an interesting question, and I think the dilemma may well be that, I would call Loddington a challenging farm. If you wanted to classify as a 3A or 3B on that scale of 1 to 5 when you land classification, it's on the verge of wanting to be grass really, and it's probably only some of the production support that have moved it into an arable arena over the last 50 or 60 years. And I think the difficulty is going to be falling between a rock and a hard place, between those that can produce on fertile land, for example, our fenland and our silts, and then in the south of England, there's some big vegetable growing areas and productive areas there, and not quite knowing where it wants to be. And actually, the marketplace doesn't value food, and it doesn't actually value the environment either enough. So actually the reward there. And I think if we're going to find systems to get around this, really, firstly, farmers' efficiency and what we do on the farm and what we have influence in is going to be really important. And secondly, perhaps some form of government support or some direction that makes it incentivize farming and the industry to go on that journey. And then possibly looking at other parts of society around carbon and biodiversity that might help, rather than just say, well, we should continue to have high levels of subsidy from government. So I think it's a three-pronged attack there to make sure that we get our environment and our food valued at its true value.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you very much.
Okay, I'll press on because I'm conscious of time. So I'll just talk a little bit about conservation agriculture, and I'll move into regenerative agriculture as well, because that's a term that a lot of people have been using recently. And a lot of people go, well, I'm already fed up of regenerative agriculture. It gets mentioned so much. But I take that attitude that actually regenerative agriculture, regenerating and renewing and rejuvenating, is such a positive story that we should talk about it and make sure we never say, oh, it's got old passé or it's old hat. I think because of that story, what we've got to make sure is that all these things around regenerative agriculture and things like the Gabe Brown story in Dirt to Soil from America, the economic message works for farmers in the United Kingdom. So if you look at conservation agriculture, reduced tillage, wide rotation, continuous soil cover, and you add livestock and a system shift to this sort of organic fusion, how do we make all those things, which in certain aspects of it can work, but not in all cases does reduced tillage work on everybody's sort of soil type. There are weed problems, there are slug problems, there are more challenges with this sort of system than there potentially are with a more conventional system. And we've certainly experienced that. How do you keep continuous soil cover? How do you keep living roots in that system? And of course, a number of you, if you're organic farmers, you'll say, well, we've found a solution to that. So how do we get around, perhaps increased diesel use? How do we get around systems where perhaps production is less? And how do we balance that so we can bring in a system that is an agroecological approach? How do we bring in livestock to, how do we form partnerships? And how do we think slightly different rather than relying on perhaps the system we've looked at in the past? And so that would be my sort of definition around regenerative agriculture. But we have to find some form of making sure that the environmental benefits out there come with a good business plan. And there'll be those who are better at doing it than others, like there are in all walks of life. And I think taking best practice and case studies and trying to find a route through is going to be one of the things for the future. So I'm going to get on to my top 10 things about environment enhancing the bottom line. And really the first one is around soil protection. And I picked a few documents here from AHDB around good soils. And that process of looking at soil organic matter, looking at pH, looking at what the nutrient status is, scoring a VES score means what your structure is. What the number of earthworms is quite a good indicator. Not all soils will perhaps proliferate with earthworms. The sandier your soil is, the more gritty it is, the more difficult it is to keep earthworms. And so really looking after our soil and balancing our soil with its nutritional needs, with its structure and organic matter are key here. And I will mention that going forward and rewarding carbon in soils in the future is fraught with difficulty, because we can have a debate about what carbon test to use for hedgerows and trees and sequestering and soil organic matter. Do we want to have a loss of ignition? Do we want to have a DOMAS? Do we want to have a separate chemical test about how we establish that? How much of it is carbon? How quickly does it disintegrate? There are some big challenges there, but looking after our soil is really is going to be a big challenge, and keeping it in the field as well. So and looking at cultivation costs, and these are some figures from some work we did in that Syngenta project, and I'll just briefly describe that really the gross margin there, or actually it's the net margin after fixed costs. And the light green color is the conventional system, which was the best system. the conventional system, the system one, which was min-till, and then the darker green bar, which was light-till. And these figures that are below the line, and I don't know if you can see my pointer, but the minus 52 and the minus were cultivation and tractor savings. So not only are you looking for savings in your cultivations around timing and around cost of doing less operations, if it's going to work, from my experience, you have to have less. You have to have a cultivator less on your min-till system, and you probably have to have a cultivator and a tractor less in your light-till system. And so, if you're going to embark on that journey of less cultivations, you have to have less fixed costs added to your less operational costs to try and redress it, so that your light-till system, which has now gone up to £468 with the savings you've made, can compete with your conventional system. But it doesn't do that every year, and weather plays a big, I would say that there's much more variability in light-till systems on heavy soil when you're challenged with the weather. Often, and blackgrass, you're forced into a spring cropping, and if spring cropping weather doesn't actually, if the weather doesn't fit your system on heavy soil, then you can come up against some difficulties. So that's just and then we talked about soil as well, and covering our soil. And these are some cover crops from Nottington. The first pictures from 4 or 5 years ago. Picture on the right is last November, and I think keeping our soil in our fields and not having bare soil is going to be a challenge as weather events get wetter. With that soil goes soil biology, goes nutrients as well. And I mentioned fenland farms and peat. Peat is not inexhaustible, and re-wetting peats and keeping them for longer may well be a challenge in 30 or 40 years for peatland farmers. So we need to find ways of perhaps covering our soil, but being able, how do we actually grow crops into there? So whether it's this is the livestock, and that's probably as much as, if anything, they've taken a bit too much of that crop off. But that's a way of livestock grazing, cover crops, clean grazing, lack of worms, finishing animals off. That's a potential for, and if it fits into an agri-environment scheme, then that's a way that some of those environmental considerations of cover crops might help. But I don't make light of the challenges about growing crops on heavy soils into cover crops, cash crops into cover crops in the spring. And then looking at rotations as well, how wider rotations might give us more opportunity to have better production out there. I see there's a hand one up there, Chris. Is it Charlie?
Quite possibly. I think it's gone down again now. Whilst I have you, we do have one more question on the subject of tree planting, if we can go for that.
Yep.
So this is from Jennifer, and it says, will the new tree planting ideas and incentives really help farmers, or actually is it more of a PR exercise aimed at certain areas, like the Sunday Times editorial?
Yeah. So I'm going to defer that to some slides a bit further on in the presentation, and I'll answer that question when we come to agroforestry and trees. But yes, I've got that. Hopefully, I'm going to cover that in a minute. So rotations, and we've always had rotations. Where our rotations have got shorter and tighter have been where we've had plant protection products and fertilizer, and we've relied on them. So our rotations got quite close and short. And I think expanding those rotations is going to be part of what, and perhaps revisiting some of our production systems of yesteryear. And, I've mentioned the challenges of cover crops, but the use of herbal lays in those rotations for natural anthelmintics and cleaner grazing into arable, and sharing with arable farmers and livestock farmers may well be an opportunity, and especially as I talk about agri-environment schemes in the future, how payments for agri-environment schemes might fit in as well. So if we look at another point would be reverse auctions. So this is some work we had on just recently, we've completed this spring on nude ponds. Now, reverse auctions aren't my favorite. There's not many auctions I go to where people bid down for the bottom. They're quite good for the public purse, but they're not necessarily always good for farmers. So whether it's the woodland carbon guarantee, or it's new ponds, or it's other schemes that are being, there is a place for them, but not at the expense of everything else. And so looking at, this is, on a small scale, this might be a way of enhancing some of those areas which are buffer watercourses or are in non-productive parts of the farm. And that would be an example of after a new pond has been delivered. That's one from another farm from about 12 months ago. And then looking at some of those other things like how we boost natural enemies and provide key resources. So looking at some of the things around safe here, shelter, alternative prey, floral resources, environment, how we might encourage crop pest predators. So, things like hoverflies, carabid beetles, and things like parasitic wasps and ladybirds. And really not only looking at how, of course, when you create these habitats, people just think it's just full of crop pest predators, but obviously it's full of pests as well. So there will be aphids in there, but hopefully an orange blossom midge, for example. But there will be a more balanced, if we haven't got monoculture with selection and biodiversity can help us redress that balance a little bit. So I think within agri-environment schemes, it's always good to look about how potentially we can use some of those natural enemies. The secret to it is what plants do we plant? How do we manage them? Does it actually work every year? How do we get rid of them quickly enough? Have we lost all our plant protection products? So actually when we do have a crisis or we do have a need to go and spray for crop failure, are there the active ingredients left in our toolbox? So these sorts of habitats around hedgerows and wild birdseed and flower-rich margins, headlands, natural regeneration, are all really important. And I think, positioning them as well in the lee of woodland where the wind perhaps drops, and this diagram is showing here where next to a hedge or a woodland is where most of the aphids drop into a field. So planting arable margins or wildflower margins or margins with umbellifers in is a good place to situate them where the wind drops, where you're going to have more likely incident of crop pests. And I think, this is, unless you're a carrot or a parsnip grower, of course, where umbellifers aren't always desirable around the edges of your field, but things like hogweed, and I mean hogweed, not giant hogweed, but wild carrot, wild angelica, creeping thistles is one that's got in there. I'm not sure many people would encourage creeping thistles on their farm, but this is some work that was done by the Farmland Ecology Unit down at GWCT. But wild parsnip, yarrow, cow parsley, these are all umbellifers which can harbour hoverflies and parasitic wasps, which do have, so rather than just planting grass margins, can we plant margins that can do some of that natural pest control for us? And so these are some of the green headlands that we had at Noddington last year. Unfortunately, we're in lockdown, so we couldn't show them to everybody. So I'm showing you them now, and you can see that, once again, these are either seed bearing for the winter, or these ones are very much for insects during the summer. And I can see, trying to fit them in with the next one, which is agri-environment schemes. So how can we get agri-environment schemes to practically on less productive land, still give us benefits? And so if you look at Noddington's countryside stewardship, or HLS, most of it was margins around the edge of the field. Most of it was buffering a few water courses. And what we've done with our new mid-tier, which has just started this year, is integrate much more in-field. So things like herbal lays, fallows, low input cereals, unharvested headlands, low input grass on what is pretty unproductive grass anyway, that's ridge and furrow, that has the remnants of old villages on it or old farmyards, is waterlogged on heavier clay soils, is not suitable for draining. So we're putting those into agri-environment schemes to spread the risk of our business, to give a bit more power from the use of agri-environment schemes into those systems. And this is where the complexity, and this is the new ELMS I talked about, the sustainable farming incentive. And the difficulty is if you have three levels with 8 standards, and there may well be more coming, how do you keep this streamlined, and how do you keep it practical? If you enter things like land maps and management plans, how do you make them so they're not just don't sit with dust on the shelf or in a central repository, but actually are implementable and understandable and verifiable to the farmer on the ground? It's a big challenge. So of course, this is what we might be faced with. And of course, this is the timeline about how we might get there. So a real big challenge about bringing in those pilots are really key to make this practical so that farmers can use agri-environment to have a win-win for their business. And we shouldn't be afraid to talk about economics and soil health and a viable business in the same breath as we talk about enhancing and looking after the environment. We need to get out of a discussion about it should be either or. So habitats like this around productive areas of either bean crops or cereal crops or grassland, encouraging natural pest predators, protecting watercourses is all part of how we should make this, but make it attractive economically to farmers, and get information out there on how these systems work and who's delivering best practice in this area. Okay, I'm going to move. I'm coming towards the end now. 3 more to do here. So we talked about the power of environment, and valuing nature, and you'll hear terms like ecosystem services. You know, if we're looking at some of our soil and our water and our air and our river networks, how do we value, and how do we value the biodiversity in them, and what's the marketplace for them? How do we value them as a society? So will carbon, for example, be the new product in the marketplace? You know, how do we get to net zero? There's a tremendous opportunity here for farmers to perhaps make sure that we can perhaps sequester our carbon, increase our soil organic matter. But is it a scheme that's just ticking boxes? Is it a scheme that perhaps others are developing and taking the lion's share of it? And does it really work? And how do farmers get rewarded for what they've already done? If you're on that journey and you're already in a high organic situation, lots of trees on your farm. And of course, the challenge is, if we're actually going to address climate change, it's the new carbon we need. So the escalator of getting to the new carbon zero, whilst others are still on a, if you like, a flat floor that's moving along that arena of already having those things. How do you balance those? So it's a really interesting discussion about how you measure, how we get rewarded on the farm for that carbon that we may well be storing. And I'll just give a few examples of that. There's a project we're involved with, and this is farmers having a superpower. So this is basically, you know, agri-capture CO2. And I would say, if you've got a chance to just have a look at it, this is a journey we're going. There's lots of carbon plans up there, and you may well find a knock on the door and someone saying, would you like to sell your carbon to me for 30, 40, 50 euros, pounds a ton? And you might say, and this is what we're doing, is we've got 5 UK partners and another 9 European partners looking at the journey there. So what's the regenerative agriculture about, how we go about that system? How do we measure it with satellite, drone, and truth verify it? And then how do we do a scheme that rewards farmers rather than the first scheme that comes along? How do we develop a scheme that's been well researched, well thought out, and we take farmers along the journey? So you'll see the sorts of things, and I mentioned some of them there. You know, livestock, growing more grass lays, storing carbon in our trees, and reducing cultivations and input efficiency are all the things that go into this project. And I'll come to trees now and agroforestry. And you know, it does slightly worry me. I mean, this is our agroforestry project at Loddington. It's 10 acres. We've got probably another 30 acres of woodland we've planted since I've been there. But we've also plastic tree guards. When does this sequester carbon? Is my farm net zero? How much of this can I sell? Are really questions for the farmer. So developing that agri-capture scheme that values things properly is really important to farmers before we embark on those decisions we might make about changing land use as well. So it's about right tree in the right place as well. You know, not sort of changing habitats. You know, if you've got open heathland and you're planting trees on it, you can change that habitat quite drastically within 20 or 30 years when it might have been a wildlife haven in its own right. Chris, is there any more questions that have popped in?
Yes, we do have. We do have one very good question. I think it's one that I and certainly a lot of other people can sympathise with as well. it's talking about maize growing and sort of experimentation in general, really. So if you're happy to answer that, then I'll go ahead.
Yeah. No, obviously,
yeah. So
incidentally, do you grow maize, Chris?
Yes, we do. So as I say,
in case I need to come to an expert.
yeah. So this question is growing maize in a dairy system is too important not to get right, which I can sympathise with. So taking a plunge is a nerve-wracking moment. I'm sure people are doing it, but we haven't been able to get anywhere to see for ourselves. How would you approach it? So really, it's about taking the plunge for the trying something new, and what's the best way.
Yeah, and of course the difficulty with maize is because of its feed value and its calorific value and its value to livestock. It's a valuable feed source. I mean, obviously, many people will be aware of the issues around maize and around late harvest and potential soil issues. But I think approaching, I mean, I think there's a couple of issues here. Is what variety you're growing, what's the harvest date, what's the biomass that it produces. So earlier varieties. A lot of people have talked about undersowing with grass as well. I know I'm not really an expert in knowing whether that works on some farms, but I'd be interested to know if other people have had experience in that area. And are you growing on the right soil type? So if you're harvesting in October and you're on heavy soil, there are some pretty good examples of some horror stories where we perhaps haven't got it right. But of course, when you do get it right, it's got a fantastic economic value to your business. So whether or not there are ways that government might support alternatives, into what might, and some people will be growing maize for anaerobic digesters. If you're using different feed sources like rye or silage or grass or anything like that, it isn't as economic as growing maize, but environmentally, there's probably some environmental benefits. So perhaps that's some of the things that Sustainable Farming Incentive and people that are doing pilots should suggest to government about making the difference up, an escalator between what might be from a maize system to what might be in an alternative feedstock system. I don't know whether that helps at all.
Yeah, I think that's a really good answer. I'm inclined to agree that it is far too important not to get right. Ultimately it's to win to feedstock, but also I think we as farmers, dairy farmers in particular, maize growers, we could certainly do more to shout about the the benefits of it. It's low agrochemical use. Certainly with the different varieties you can grow now, we can negate some of those harvest risks. Although obviously it's you can never say never. And there's sort of the low input and high energy output. I think it is a fantastic crop, but you're right, there are some horror stories that go with it.
I think the other thing I'd say, Chris, is that I might not win many friends here, but actually we have to take responsibility for the crop that's in our field. And sometimes if we're relying on other people to do it, we still have to have ownership of that field. So whatever state it's left in or starts in, and it's also a problem with short-term agreements around vegetable production as well. Have we got enough time for the next crop? What are we sowing after it? If we and I'm not casting aspersions on contractors, but if contractors enter the field, plough, drill, spray, and harvest, do we visit the field and make sure that some of those things you talked about, or some of the things I talked about undersowing and harvesting and varieties, have we got ownership in here about that? So I think there's a part to play for all of us, rather than being left at the end saying, oh well, actually I didn't realize that was going to happen. So I might move off that subject before I dip my toes in any more hot water. So so just looking about carbon and looking about trees and yes, there will be hopefully a marketplace, but I do think I might talk about sustainability of this. I'm it's a little bit hypocritical of me here. I'm showing you an agroforestry project from last year here, and of course there's lots of plastic tree guards and double staked for sheep to graze around it. And I mean, these trees will probably get to be 10 years old before they pay back the plastic and wood that I've already felled to stand them up. So I think I'd love to invite Richie Sunak and Boris Johnson and others from George Eustace and Victoria Prentice out to the farm and say, how do we get things like renewable woolen tree guards out on farm? Because the thought of 70 million plastic tree guards around our farms fills me with a bit of dread into the future. And I think, comments that you've alluded to around, is it just window dressing? There has to be a better business plan than just putting plastic and trees around everywhere, right tree in the right place. But also, let's look at farm energy as well. There is, what you plant your trees for, whether you plant them for fruit, whether you plant them for nuts, whether you plant them for amenity value, whether it be sporting interest, whether it be for health and well-being, whether it be for ecotourism, whether it be for energy. That environmental and things like the Woodland Carbon Guarantee and some of the woodland grants can give the ability to renew and grow your own fuel for the future. So we have 2 wood-fired boilers on the farm, 3 solar panels. So we're trying to reduce our farm energy, use some of those natural processes, some of that environment to help our bottom line, and as we say, drive that bottom line and drive us and make us more productive. Just in the window, looking ahead, I'm on my last 2 or 3 slides now, but catchment management in the future, those of you that farm around river valleys and working in catchment sensitive farming, working in cluster groups, will this be a resource that we'll need in the future to allow us to store water better, build more reservoirs, value the scarcity of water at some parts of the year, and then at other times of the year we're just letting water go out into our seas and oceans. So how do we store water in our soils as individual farmers, but also how do we store water for the rest of society? So that's an issue which might end up paying us in the future. And so and trying to avoid, and sometimes when I show this picture, this is from 2019, and you see the River Welland winding its way through the valley and the Ibrook Reservoir, and that soil going into the Ibrook Reservoir. Some of these processes are natural, but some of the ways we farm, and you can see at that time of year, a lot of arable crops going in and big heavy rainfall events of 2, 3, 4 inches within a 24-hour period, causing these issues. How do we try and improve our management, and then how do we get society to help us try and value that? So there's some issues there that might give us a bit more scope for valuing what I call a public goods for public money. And of course, it was Dieter Helm, the author of the 25-year environment plan, who once had said, if we don't pay much public money, we can't really expect much public good. And I think that's something that if we are trying to reduce a £3 billion bill for single farm payment, then actually a system for trying to find the cheapest option by reverse auction or not paying very much money really does devalue the environmental goods that farmers can provide. And my final slides here about farm clusters and the power of them. So the Martin Down cluster and some of the other clusters around the south of England as well, Margaret Downs, and there's a real benefit from joining up. Farming can be quite an isolated occupation many times, and I think joining up with your fellow farmers and across some members of the general public and interested local communities is really liberating as well. But I'm really interested in that last word in the top there, and the power of farm clusters and collaboration and facilitation, often driven by a species, a fish, a dormouse, a turtle dove, a butterfly, a plant, a barn owl, for example. But is it having created that, you really have created your marketing label, local marketing, change of habitat to try and get that balance I talked about around environment and food production. And it's really good for social capital as well. So the resource of people and volunteers, whether it's planting a community orchard or whether it be helping out on your open farm Sunday or helping me out with my Leicester longwalls, or making our orchard going for cider apples. All those things help with building up, a workforce that sometimes can help that doesn't always want being paid for, which often can help you in the bottom line as well. So, and their interest is in the environment and their local landscape. And really, my final slide is about was mentioning around that environmental provenance and looking at how local authorities can help. So this is a piece of work that we're doing in the National Farmers Union and the Allerton Project and Leicester County Council. And it's really 5 streams of work. We have streamlined down into 3 now, but how do we get Leicestershire to locally procure their food so it meets their strategic economic plan? And it also mentions their very thorough environmental strategy, because it talks about improving environment, it talks about jobs. And then how do we get, so with that in mind, how do we get councils to reduce their carbon footprint rather than going for the lowest factor of food production and cheapest of price, and say with it comes food produced right on your doorstep, farmers locking up carbon, shortening food chains. But if we're going to go down there, we really do need to have producer groups that can do that and work together to provide all year round food. So the second work stream is producer groups. And the third group we've got, and we've linked that with the innovation one and skills, future skills, is what does climate friendly farming look like? And what does a climate friendly food chain look like? And how do we get youngsters in that can help innovate and help us with that journey? And the last example is a well-established food hub at Melton, which is actually putting it into practice. So annual food fairs, around cheese, around beer, around lots of local growers from nationally and from the East Midlands. How do we incentivize, how do we build on those things that we might already have with our cluster groups and market our provenance around local food and making a difference and saying, actually, in this new environment of climate change and Brexit, it's about time we stop talking about what the barriers were in the past and embracing the future. And I think it's really about thinking local but delivering global. And I think with that sort of end strap line, I'll probably stop sharing and come back into the room, as it were, Chris.
Excellent. Thank you very much. We have gone slightly over time, but we have got a couple of questions here. So hopefully if everyone's able to hang about, we'll run for 5 minutes more and then probably say goodbye after that. So along the similar lines to the maize question, really, and also a very good question from Anthony. He said there can be a great cost to changing cultivation and drilling systems, not only the cash investment in machinery, but also lost production whilst experimenting with systems or as soil regenerates. Has any thought gone into easing these sorts of transitions for farmers?
Yeah, I think this is some of the dilemmas that DEFRA are faced with around productivity grants and innovation grants, and if you look at the Soil Association about farmers getting together in their innovative farmers, so sharing that experience. I would also say it's always best to start small and learn by your mistakes. And I mean, we've made a few at Loddington as well. I'm quite happy to admit that. That's part of our remit, and also make sure that you tell people about those challenges around. It's not always right to direct drill. It's not always right to have a green bridge. It's not always right for a cover crop. So I think around machinery investment is machinery rings, sharing machinery. Farmers notoriously always want it at the same time, so it's more often difficult to share machinery. But for example, with contractors doing silage, perhaps and pea harvesting and pea drilling and maize harvesting and maize drilling, there are ways of investing in this equipment. But I think certainly around productivity grants and investment in regenerative and more drills and cultivation equipment and systems. And also around, because this integrated pest management, we hear a lot of talk from the government about integrated pest management is going to be a thing of the future, or continue and build on what we're already doing. But we're also getting, we're not seeing much evidence of some of those options available to farmers. So I think with the next iteration of grants, I think we will, and certainly from the National Farmers Union, we're always pushing about productivity and about, if you want to take farmers on the journey, you have to give them some incentives. I see Charlie's got his hand raised. He's gone down again.
Well, Charlie, if you have a question, if you'd like to.
Charlie's in the room.
I've just given him permission to ask his question.
If you'd like to unmute.
Can you hear me, Phil?
Yes, I can, Charlie.
Tell me, how does this all work without glyphosate?
Yeah, that's a good question. And of course, if those of I think there would be organic farmers who say, well, we've managed to do without glyphosate. There would be other people who say that they're trying to find systems that rely less on glyphosate, for example, using herbal lays with not much grass in them, and they're using other chemistry perhaps when it goes back into the crop. But you're right to, Charlie, to raise the point about glyphosate is a backbone of a lot of regenerative farming and a lot of cover cropping systems and reduced cultivation systems, and it is a challenge. What I would say is, if you look at the National Action Plan that's just come out around IPM, and there are times when perhaps judicious use of glyphosate might be much more beneficial for soil rather than perhaps continual cultivation, perhaps electrocuting weeds or flame throwing weeds. So I think what I'm trying to say is that not all cultural methods don't do damage. Other cultural methods can do damage to the environment, as can biological control as well, in the fact that if you release thousands of lacewings or thousands of parasitic wasps, it's very difficult if something goes wrong to put them back in the bottle. Whereas we're often seen as chemicals as a last resort. I'd much rather like to see a circular diagram where the right use of products like glyphosate and based on evidence and science rather than emotive subjects is used to determine the future of these products and how we use them in a balanced way. So I don't know whether that answers your question, Charlie, but that's probably where I am on that subject. I see Jan's back in the room as well.
Yeah, I think if we could take our last question from Jan, then I think we ought to wrap it up.
I think it's more a comment than anything about your point with relation to tree guards, in that there is in development a tree guard without plastic, which is based or takes its base from wool. And strangely enough, it's being developed by the son of the person who developed the original tree guards, I don't know how many years ago. But there is a route to there is a route to biodegradable tree guards there, I think.
There is indeed, and I believe, I think his name's Charlie Hurlton, I think, and it's Next Gen Tree Guard. Yeah, this is a combination of British wool, I believe, and other organic material. And actually, I spoke to Charlie last week, and hopefully we've got some guards on the way to us. But Charlie's, I think it's Charlie. I might have got his first name wrong. Apologies to him. But I think the biggest problem they've got is actually firstly making sure that the tree guards degenerate at an acceptable rate, so they don't go too quickly, and also I think they've got a massive marketplace for these tree guards in the future. Is getting them to a price that perhaps that's why I'd like to see Rishi and Boris out putting the first tree guard on a plant and supporting that initiative. So yeah, you're right to pull that up. Yeah, and that's a very good example of where we might, and it might be a solution for some of the issues around British wool that we're finding a lack of marketplace for it.
Yeah, that's very good comment. I suppose hopefully as a biodegradable tree guard, it'll stay the course and last as long as it needs to protect the tree as well.
Yeah, as long as the rabbit, the deer, and the whatever else will eat it, or my sheep don't get to it.
Yeah. So I'm aware that we've already run a little bit over time, so we should probably draw things to a close there. So first of all, I want to say a massive thanks to massive thanks, Phil, for your time. Certainly, I found it really interesting. I think actually one of the most salient points for me was one of your earlier slides. You put a comment up about your trials with lower tillage and showing that there was potential for 50% less CO2 emissions by year 2, which I think is potentially a massive selling point for us as the agricultural industry if we can move in that direction.
I would just add in there that along with opportunity, there are challenges. And the other thing is Gary Holston is just come to me as the guy from Next Gen Wool Guards. Yeah. Sorry, Chris. I interrupted.
Yeah. No, that's quite all right. So, look, as promised, first of all, thanks ever so much. I mentioned at the beginning that if anyone has any ideas for any future topics for these sessions, then please feel free to put it in the group chat now. that what we're trying to do with these is to discuss the topics that are that are key and important to to all of us as farmers here and now. So yeah, please, any help and advice on any topics that people would like us to discuss, please put them in the discussion. Finally, our next technical forum is on the 30th of June. And that's with George Brown, who is a new entrant into the dairy industry. He's a really interesting bloke, and with some really, really interesting views, and certainly slightly different views, and on getting into farming from a non-farming background. So a date for your diary, and hopefully we'll see you all then. And finally, I'd also just like to say thanks to Duncan, Doug, Tom, and Wiz for the help, the rest of the committee for getting this organised. And finally, again, a massive thanks, Phil, for your time. So I hope everyone's enjoyed themselves, and hopefully I will see you all on the 30th of June with George. Thanks so much. Take care.